The howl of the wind outside was a familiar lament, a cold lullaby for the woman huddled in the cabin. Ilara, too old to be a mother again, felt the weight not only of the snow covering the world, but also of the new life growing within her. A widow, alone, and with hunger gnawing, each day was a battle against despair. Broken Stone Castle, once a refuge, now seemed merely another frozen tomb, its stone walls breathing the same cold that penetrated her bones. The promise made to her late husband to protect her family echoed in her mind. But how could she protect a life that had barely begun when her own was slipping away? Moss covered the stones, and the echo of her steps resonated through the empty halls, where bird nests nestled in shattered stained glass windows. But there were no birds now, only the oppressive silence of winter and the creak of old wood under the pressure of the snow. Ilara, with trembling hands but an unshakable spirit, searched the forgotten corners, looking for any piece of firewood that could feed the improvised fire, a fragile ember that was the only barrier between her and death by freezing. Each day, the struggle was against the elements, against the scorn that had followed her since she was expelled from the village. But hope, however fragile, burned like an ember hidden beneath the ashes, fueled by the promise of a new heart beating within her. Ilara's belly, already prominent, was a constant reminder of the life she carried and the overwhelming responsibility that came with it. The hunger was no longer just hers, it was the hunger of two. Her fingers, swollen and purplish from the cold, could barely hold the last piece of hard bread, which she chewed slowly, trying to extract every calorie, every crumb of sustenance. The taste was of mold and despair, but it was all she had. A stronger gust of wind made the entire cabin groan, and a thin layer of powdered snow slipped through a crack in the roof, settling like an icy veil over her head. Ilara sighed, a white vapor that quickly dissipated in the cold air. She needed to find a way to seal that crack, and so many others. Her eyes swept the gloomy interior, searching for something, anything that might serve. Her gaze fell upon one of the windows, the only one that still held a few fragments of glass, though cracked and opaque with decades of grime. It was a forgotten window, hidden behind a pile of rubble and cobwebs. With a painful effort, Ilara dragged herself over, pushing aside loose stones and rotten pieces of wood. The glass was so dirty she could barely see through it. She coughed, the dust irritating her dry throat. With the sleeve of her tattered cloak, she began to clean a small circle on the glass, expecting to see only the relentless whiteness of the blizzard outside. But what she saw made her heart stop. It wasn't snow. It wasn't the monotonous grey of winter. It was a vibrant green, a cloudless sky blue, and a golden sun that seemed to shine with impossible intensity. Leaves swayed on leafy trees. Brightly colored flowers bloomed in a meadow that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air seemed to vibrate with the song of birds and the buzz of insects, a chorus of life that contrasted brutally with the deadly silence of her world. Ilara blinked, rubbing her eyes harder. Was it a mirage, a hallucination caused by hunger and cold? She touched the glass. It was warm. Not just warm, but hot, as if the sun of that impossible summer was truly beating down there. A ray of light, golden and vivid, pierced the small, clean circle, cutting through the cabin's gloom and landing directly on the wooden floor, a few steps from her feet. And then the impossible became unbelievable. Where the sunbeam touched the floor, the old parched wood began to change. Tiny green shoots, thin as hairs, emerged from the cracks and crevices, growing with terrifying speed. In a matter of seconds, they transformed into sturdier stalks, with minuscule leaves unfolding, and then small white and yellow flowers. The scent of damp earth and fresh vegetation, a long-forgotten aroma, filled the air. Ilara recoiled, stumbling over her own feet, her eyes wide with terror and fascination. Her body trembled, no longer just from cold, but from a profound shock that shook her soul. What was this? Magic? A blessing? Or a cruel trap? The sun's warmth, which now spread from the window to the rest of the cabin, was undeniable, and the scent of life sprouting from the floor was real. Hunger still tormented her, but now a new and terrible hope began to burn within her, as vivid and dangerous as the eternal summer that opened in the window. She was surrounded by snow, but inside her cabin, a piece of paradise seemed to have been torn from the fabric of reality. The tension was palpable, the promise of salvation mixed with the fear of the unknown. What else could this window bring? And what would be the price? Ilara's heart beat like a wild drum against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of terror and a hope so brutal it almost suffocated her. The green shoots, now small plants with tender leaves and tiny flowers, continued to spread across the wooden floor, following the golden trail of the sun. The scent of damp earth and dew of blossoming life was almost intoxicating, a shocking contrast to the mold and dampness that had previously dominated the cabin. She extended a trembling hand, her fingers purple and cracked, and touched one of the leaves. It was soft, cool to the touch, but the energy radiating from the sunbeam warmed her, a silent promise of heat and sustenance. Hunger, which had been a constant dull ache, now transformed into a sharp cry in her stomach. Those plants, could they be food? The idea was absurd, dangerous. Plants that sprouted from nothing, in seconds, under a summer sun that shouldn't exist. The fear of the unknown was a poison, but hunger was a quicker, deadlier poison. And it wasn't just her hunger. She placed her hand on her prominent belly, feeling the slight movement within. A new life depended on her, a life that had yet to know the biting cold or the emptiness of the stomach. Ilara knelt with difficulty, the old wood creaking under her weight. Her eyes, previously fixed on terror, now focused on the promise. The flowers were small, white and yellow, with a center that seemed to concentrate light. The leaves, a green so intense they seemed to glow, were plump and inviting. She hesitated, her mind screaming warnings about poison, about traps. But what else did she have to lose? Death by starvation was a certainty, slow and painful. This, at least, offered a chance, however minuscule and insane. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire winter, Ilara plucked one of the larger leaves. She brought it to her nose, sniffing. There was no strange odor, only the freshness of vegetation. With a dry mouth, she nibbled a tiny piece. The taste was mild, slightly sweet, with an earthy hint. There was no bitterness, no numbness. She chewed slowly, feeling the tender texture dissolve on her tongue. She swallowed, waited. Minutes dragged, each second an eternity. Nothing, no dizziness, no pain. Just a subtle warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling of fullness. Hunger was still there, but the despair had lessened. With newfound courage, fueled by necessity and the life she carried, Ilara began to harvest more. She filled her hands, then the fold of her tattered cloak. The plants continued to grow, as if they knew they were being harvested, replenishing themselves almost instantly. It was a miracle, an inexhaustible source of food that sprouted from nothing. As she ate, sitting on the cold cabin floor, bathed in the warm sunbeam that seemed to melt the ice in her veins, Ilara looked at the window. The eternal summer outside was a tapestry of colors and sounds. She could distinguish the hum of bees, the chirping of birds that would never see snow. It was a vibrant, pulsating world, completely oblivious to the desolation that surrounded her. The window was not just an opening to another place, it was a frontier, a thin barrier between two irreconcilable worlds. The tension, however, did not diminish. On the contrary, it intensified. Her gratitude for the food and warmth was immense, but Ilara's mind could not ignore how unnatural it all was. Where did that window come from? Why was it there, in a forgotten cabin, in the midst of a brutal winter? And what would be the price of such a gift? History was full of tales of magical gifts that came with terrible costs. She thought of her late husband, of the promise she had made to protect her family. Now, that family was just her and the baby in her womb. Was this miracle the answer to her prayers, or a lure from some ancient, hungry entity? The cabin, once a frozen refuge, was now a stage for the inexplicable. The eternal summer in the window was a vision of paradise, but the silence of winter outside, the distant howl of the wind, was a constant reminder of the reality that awaited her if she dared to cross that frontier. Elara felt a new wave of energy, not just from the food, but from hope. She needed to understand. She needed to explore. But with caution. The warmth of the window's sun had already dried some of the cracks in the roof, and the air inside the cabin was noticeably milder. Life, which seemed to have abandoned that place, now sprouted from the floor, a green and vibrant promise. But the promise came with a mystery, and mysteries, Elara knew, were always dangerous. She stood up, her belly heavy, but her body a little lighter, her gaze fixed on the window, where the sun of an impossible summer continued to shine, inviting and menacing. What else lay hidden behind that glass, and how could she use this gift without losing herself to it? The struggle for survival had just gained a completely new and terrifying dimension. The new energy pulsing in Elara was not just the warmth of food in her stomach, it was the spark of curiosity, the flame of hope, and the cold shiver of terror. She approached the window again, her steps firmer yet still hesitant, as if the floor might give way beneath the altered reality. The sunbeam, once a golden thread, now spread more widely across the floor, the green plants extending like a living carpet in its path. The air inside the cabin, previously biting, was now strangely mild, a microclimate of summer in the heart of winter. Her fingers, still marked by the cold, touched the glass. It was warm, vibrant, almost pulsing with the life it radiated. She pressed the palm of her hand against the surface, feeling the energy, the warmth that seemed to penetrate her bones. It was real. The summer outside was not an illusion. But what was it? Elara leaned in, trying to see beyond the small circle she had cleaned. With the sleeve of her cloak, she began to clean more, expanding her view. The dirt and mold came off with surprising ease, as if the sun's warmth was softening them. Slowly, the summer landscape revealed itself in a larger expanse. Tall trees, with lush green leaves, rose in a distant grove. Flowers of every imaginable color dotted a meadow that seemed to stretch infinitely. She could see small, colorful butterflies fluttering, and what appeared to be bees buzzing around giant flowers. What shocked her most, however, was the absolute stillness of the scene. The leaves swayed gently, the butterflies flew, but there was no wind, not the slightest breeze that could justify the movement. It was as if time were suspended, a living painting, yet static in its perfection. The golden sun, which warmed the glass and made life sprout on the cabin floor, did not move in the sky. It was always midday, always the peak of summer. She tried to open the window. The wooden frame was rotten and swollen, but the sun's warmth seemed to have softened the wood, making it less resistant. With a groan of effort, Elara pushed, pulled, forced. The window did not move. It was as if it were sealed, not by rust or rot, but by an invisible force, an insurmountable barrier. She hit the glass with the palm of her hand. The sound was muffled, almost hollow, as if she were hitting a wall of firm jelly. What she could not deny was the scent, the aroma of damp earth, of freshly cut grass, of blossoming flowers, was so strong now that it almost masked the smell of mold and rot in the cabin. It was a scent of life, of abundance, of a world where hunger and cold did not exist. And that scent, that promise, was almost as intoxicating as the warmth. Ilara stepped back a little, her heart beating hard. It was a window that was not a window. It was a frontier, a door to another place, but a door that could not be opened. And what was on the other side? A paradise? An illusion? Or something more sinister waiting to be discovered? The tension increased with each passing second. The miracle was undeniable, but the absence of a logical explanation was a heavy burden. Ilara's mind, accustomed to the harsh reality of survival, struggled to process the impossible. She thought of her husband, a practical man, a hunter. Would he have tried to break the glass? Or would he have fled, fearing the supernatural? She did not have the luxury of either option. Breaking the glass would mean destroying the source of heat and food. Fleeing would mean certain death in the relentless winter. She knelt again, observing the plants. They continued to grow, small green vines extending through the floor cracks, following the golden trail of the sun. Some of the white and yellow flowers had already transformed into small fruits, similar to blackberries, but of a light green hue. Ilara hesitated. If the leaves were safe, would the fruits be too? Hunger, though lessened, was still a presence. With the same desperate courage, she picked one of the fruits. It was soft to the touch, with a sweet and fresh scent. She bit into it. An explosion of sweetness and a slightly acidic taste filled her mouth. It was delicious, juicy, and the feeling of satiety was almost immediate. As she ate, observing the miracle unfold, Ilara noticed something else. In the lower corner of the glass, almost imperceptible beneath a thin layer of dirt she hadn't yet cleaned, there was an engraving. It wasn't a crack, but a symbol carved into the glass itself. It was a circle with a vertical line in the middle, and two horizontal lines extending outwards from the circle like open arms. It was an ancient symbol, one she had seen in some legends told by her grandmother about harvest gods and pacts with the earth. A shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't just a window to an eternal summer, it was something more, something intentional. The cabin wasn't just abandoned. Perhaps it had been a sanctuary or a trap. The life sprouting from the floor wasn't a coincidence. It was a response, perhaps an offering. But every offering had a price, and the symbol on the glass seemed to be the signature of whoever was offering it. The warmth of the window's sun had already melted. The snow accumulated in the roof crack above her, and the dripping had ceased. The cabin was transforming, from a frozen tomb to a strangely warm and verdant nursery, but the sense of security was deceptive. The world outside was still a white hell, and the world in the window was a silent, unchanging paradise. Ilara placed her hand on her belly. The baby moved again, a gentle yet urgent reminder of her responsibility. She had found a source of life, but the source was shrouded in mystery and danger. She needed to understand the symbol. She needed to understand who had created that window and why. Survival now depended not only on her physical strength, but on her cunning. She was trapped between two worlds, and the price of her salvation was yet to be revealed. The struggle was no longer just against snow and hunger. It was against the unknown, against the ancient magic that had nestled in her cabin. And that struggle, she knew, would be the most dangerous of all. The sight of the symbol engraved on the glass was not just a curiosity, it was a direct blow to Ilara's memory, an echo of the stories whispered by her grandmother. The circle, the vertical line, the open arms. It was not mere decoration. It was a language, a pact, an ancestral signature. Her grandmother, a woman who lived on the fringes of the modern world, still revered the ancients of the earth, the primordial entities that governed harvest, fertility, and the very cycles of life. She remembered the warnings, her grandmother's eyes widening slightly when she spoke of the ancients' gifts. They were never free. They always came with a price, often terrible, paid in sacrifice. The warmth that heated the cabin, the sweet taste of the fruits in her mouth, suddenly took on a sinister tone. Ilara was not just receiving a gift, she was perhaps accepting the terms of an agreement she did not understand. The cabin, once a refuge, now seemed like a waiting chamber, a stage for an ancient drama where she was the unwitting protagonist. Her gaze moved from the symbol to the static summer beyond the glass, the immutable perfection, the sun that did not move, the butterflies that flew without wind. Everything seemed like a carefully staged scene, an illusion to attract. For whom? For her. The idea of being watched, of being part of an experiment, sent a shiver down her spine. The hum of bees and the chirping of birds, once comforting, now sounded like echoes of a trapped world, a repetitive, soulless melody. Ilara's hand instinctively went to her belly. The baby, her promise. She had sworn to protect him, but how could she protect a life from a force that defied reality itself? What could the ancients of the earth demand in exchange for such a miracle? Ilara's mind filled with dark images from legends, of firstborn sacrifices, of pacts sealed with blood. She pushed the thoughts away with a tremor, but the fear persisted. The plants on the floor continued their relentless growth. A new vine, thicker and a shade of almost dark green, snaked towards her feet, its leaves unfolding with an almost aggressive urgency. It was life, yes, but rampant life, without nature's limits, and that was more disturbing than any desolation. Ilara stood up, her eyes scanning the small cabin. The summer light, once a relief, now seemed to expose every dusty corner, every cobweb, as if the gaze from the other world was stripping bare the cabin, and with it, Ilara herself. The air, previously heavy with mold, now smelled of damp earth and an intense floral perfume, an aroma that was both intoxicating and oppressive. She approached the opposite wall, where the snow still pressed against the logs, a chilling reminder of the reality outside. The contrast was brutal, a white tomb on one side, a green and silent paradise on the other. And she, Ilara, was trapped in the middle, a bridge between two irreconcilable worlds. The silence of the eternal summer was what disturbed her most. There was no whisper of wind, no subtle shift of light, no natural passage of time. It was a frozen moment, a perfect and immutable image. What kind of summer was this that never ended, never aged, never knew autumn or winter? It was a summer without consequences, and that, Ilara realized, was terrifying. Life without the natural cycle was an aberration, a violation of the laws her grandmother so respected. She returned to the window, her fingers tracing the symbol, not daring to touch the glass directly over it. The lines felt cold beneath her skin, despite the warmth radiating from the window, a strange dichotomy, a cold fire. What if the window wasn't just a source of food and warmth, but a passage for something to come from there? The idea made her heart race. She had presumed the barrier was to keep her out of the summer world, but what if it was to keep something in, or even more frightening, to allow something to observe? She leaned in, trying to see beyond the static landscape. The butterflies, the bees, the lush foliage. Were they truly alive, or just perfect facsimiles? The absence of a breeze, the absolute stillness, it was a captive world, just like her, in a different way. An almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floor. Ilara froze, all her senses on high alert. Was it the wind outside shaking the old structure, or something more? She waited, but the sound did not repeat. It could be her imagination, sharpened by fear and exhaustion. But the hairs on her arms stood on end. The plants continued their silent, rapid expansion. A new shoot, thicker and more robust than the others, now pushed through a crack in the floor, directly beneath the symbol. It was a dark stem, almost black, different from the vibrant green of the other plants, and it was growing with alarming speed, stretching upwards, as if drawn by an invisible thread towards the symbol itself. Ilara recoiled, her breath caught in her throat. That was not just a miracle. It was an entity, a presence, manifesting itself. The symbol was not just a mark, it was a conduit, and something was responding. Her mind screamed at her to flee, to run back into the brutal winter, but her body, heavy with the child, knew it would be a death sentence. She was trapped. Trapped by the snow, trapped by the cold, and now trapped by this impossible and terrifying summer. She needed to understand. She needed to find a way to communicate, to decipher the terms of this ancient pact before it was too late. The warmth, the food, the promise of life for her baby, everything was intertwined with this growing, silent dread. The struggle for survival had escalated from a physical battle against nature to a desperate fight against the supernatural, against forces she could barely comprehend. And that struggle, she knew, would be the most dangerous of all. The dark, almost black stem that sprouted from the floor beneath the symbol engraved on the window was not like the other vines. It lacked the lush green vibrancy that spread across the floor. It was dense, almost woody, and its ascent was terrifyingly fast. Ilara watched, paralyzed as it twisted and stretched, not in search of light, but as if pulled by an invisible force, directly towards the center of the circle carved into the glass. It was a physical, undeniable manifestation of the presence she felt. The tremor that had previously seemed imaginary now vibrated in the floor, a subtle pulsation that seemed to come from the earth itself, or perhaps from what lay beyond the window. Fear chilled her veins, a cruel contrast to the oppressive warmth radiating from the eternal summer. It was no longer just hunger or cold that threatened her. It was something ancient, something that demanded. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, clearer now than ever. The ancients of the earth give with one hand, but collect with the other. And what they collect, child, is always of equal value to what was given. Life for life. That was the primordial law, whispered on new moon nights when shadows danced and the world felt thinner. Ilara stepped back one pace, then another, until her back touched the opposite wall, cold and snow-covered outside. The contrast was a slap in the face. On one side, deadly winter. On the other, a summer that was a trap. She was in the middle, a potential prey. The baby in her belly stirred again, a gentle movement that brought her back to reality. She couldn't flee. She couldn't surrender to panic. She had to understand. She had to fight. Her eyes fixed on the dark stem. It had already grown several inches, and small leaves, an emerald green so dark they almost appeared black, began to unfold. They didn't have the rounded shape of the other plants. They were pointed, almost claw-like, and opened in a pattern that, to Ilara's horror, vaguely resembled the open arms of the symbol on the glass. It was a living signature, growing before her eyes. The air in the cabin grew denser, the intense floral perfume, now almost suffocating, mixed with a new scent, earthy and damp, like an ancient forest after rain. It was the smell of rampant life, but also the smell of something primordial awakening. Ilara felt a weight on her chest, an invisible pressure that seemed to squeeze the air from her lungs. She closed her eyes, trying to concentrate, searching the depths of her memory for more fragments of her grandmother's legends. The ancients of the earth, the pacts, the sacrifices, they weren't just offerings of food or goods, they were sacrifices of time, of promises, sometimes of firstborns. A shiver ran through her body. What could a window of eternal summer, capable of generating life on a wooden floor, demand in return? When she opened her eyes, the dark stem had grown even further, and a small flower, a deep, almost black purple, began to open at its tip, directly beneath the symbol. It was no ordinary flower. Its petals were thin and translucent, and at its center, a faint pulsating glow seemed to emanate. It was like an eye watching her. Ilara felt an irresistible urge to approach. It was dangerous, she knew, but curiosity and the need to understand were stronger than fear. Slowly, she knelt again, maintaining a cautious distance. The flower pulsed softly, and an almost inaudible hum, different from the buzzing of the bees outside, seemed to come from it. It was a deep, grave sound that resonated in her bones. She extended her hand, hesitating. The warmth of the window was intense, but the dark flower seemed to emit a subtle cold, a dichotomy that left her even more confused. Her fingers hovered over the outermost petal without touching it. The flower seemed to lean slightly towards her, as if inviting her. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. She didn't expect an answer, but the flower seemed to vibrate more intensely. Suddenly, a vivid image arose in her mind, not as a memory, but as a projection. It was an image of her grandmother, young and strong, in a golden field under a radiant sun, offering a basket of ripe fruits to an indistinct figure, enveloped in light. The figure seemed to accept, and in place of the basket, a small seed sprouted from the ground. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Ilara breathless. It wasn't a memory of her grandmother. It was a memory of her, Ilara, but from a time that never existed, in a place she had never seen. It was a vision, a message, the seed. What did the seed represent? What did the ancients of the earth want from her? She looked at her belly, then at the pulsating flower. The baby moved again, stronger this time, as if responding to the flower's presence. A shiver ran through Ilara. The seed, life, the promise. Would her baby be the price? The thought was a blow to her stomach, a dread so profound it made her stagger. The dark flower seemed to glow brighter, and the hum intensified, filling the cabin. It was not a threat, but an expectation, a silent yet undeniable demand. Ilara felt that time was running out. She was not just receiving a gift, she was being invited into a pact, an ancestral agreement with forces she could barely conceive. And the first term, the first glimpse of the price, had just been revealed in a terrifying vision. The struggle for survival had transformed into a race against time to decipher the language of the ancients. Before the price was collected in a way she could not bear, the air in the cabin seemed to have solidified, heavy with the revelation. The baby, her baby, the price. The idea was a poison spreading through her veins, chilling her blood despite the suffocating warmth from the window. No, it couldn't be. Not after all she had endured, not after the promise of life now pulsing within her. The vision of her grandmother, the basket of fruits, the sprouting seed, everything clicked with brutal, devastating clarity. The ancients didn't just want a seed. They wanted the seed, the firstborn, the fruit of her own womb. Ilara staggered back, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. Dread was a wild animal in her chest, scratching, tearing. The hum of the dark flower grew more insistent, a grave melody that seemed to echo the beat of her own heart, or perhaps the beat of the tiny heart within her. It was a song of expectation, a silent demand that she now understood in its entirety. She refused to accept. Life was sacred, a gift, not a currency of exchange. Her grandmother, in her stories, always spoke of respect, of balance, of giving and receiving. But this was extortion, a dark pact disguised as a miracle. The warmth that enveloped her, the green sprouting from the floor, the very air she breathed, everything now seemed tainted, a poisoned gift. Her eyes fixed on the dark purple flower, which pulsed like a heart beating outside a body. The translucent petals, the faint glow at the center, the shape that resembled an eye. It wasn't just a flower, it was the mouth of something ancient, speaking a language without words, but with terrifying clarity. She felt that the flower wasn't just observing, it was evaluating. evaluating the life she carried, the promise she represented. The memory of the vision returned, more detailed now, the indistinct figure enveloped in light. It wasn't a benign light, Ilara now realized, but a light that consumed, that absorbed, and the seed that sprouted from the ground in place of the basket of fruits. It wasn't a new life, but a replacement, a trade, the life of the earth for human life. And what if the vision wasn't a memory of her grandmother, but a projection of her own future, a premonition of what was to come if she didn't act? A chill ran through Ilara, but this time it wasn't from the external cold. It was the chill of understanding, of powerlessness. The snow outside was an insurmountable barrier, winter a death sentence. And in here, the eternal summer was a prison, an altar for an unthinkable sacrifice. She was cornered, but the maternal instinct, stronger than any fear, began to bubble within her. No, she would not allow it. She would not surrender her child, her only link to the future, her only hope. The struggle for survival had transformed. It was no longer about finding food or warmth. It was about protecting the life she carried against the forces that had saved her. Ilara approached the flower again, this time with fierce determination in her eyes. She did not kneel. She remained standing, defiant, her hands still on her belly. "I won't," she whispered, her voice choked but firm. "You will not have my baby." The flower pulsed harder, and the hum intensified, filling the cabin with a vibration that seemed to penetrate her bones. It was not a response of anger, but of unshakable persistence, of ancient certainty. It was as if the flower said, "You have no choice." Suddenly, the glow at the center of the flower intensified, and a new image burst into Ilara's mind, more vivid, more disturbing than the previous one. This time she saw herself, not young and strong, but old and wrinkled, alone in a barren field, the relentless sun punishing the cracked earth. She was extending empty hands to the sky, not in offering, but in despair, in a silent plea for something that had been lost, something that had never been born. The image was one of profound loneliness, of a regret that gnawed at the soul. Then the image changed. She saw her own baby, but not in her arms. Instead, the child was floating, enveloped in a soft light, surrounded by a landscape of eternal summer, identical to that seen through the window. The baby seemed happy, serene, but there was no human warmth, no touch. It was a life preserved, but separate, a perfect offering, untouched by the hardships of the world. The vision vanished, leaving Ilara breathless, her heart beating wildly. It was a choice then. The loneliness and sterility of a life without a pact, or the preservation of her child in a world that was not hers, a world that would take him for its own. The ancients didn't just want the baby. They wanted the baby for themselves, for their own realm of eternal summer. It was a promise of life, yes, but a life without a mother, without the human connection Ilara so longed for. The dark stem, which had previously seemed to stretch towards the symbol, now appeared to curve slightly towards her, like an accusing finger. The small, claw-shaped leaves seemed to contract. The floral perfume became almost hallucinogenic, and the earthy, damp scent intensified, as if the very earth were breathing there inside the cabin. Ilara knew that time was running out. The language of the ancients was not one of words, but of visions, of feelings, of undeniable demands. She had been warned, and now the price was being displayed in all its terrible glory. The cabin, once a refuge, was now a negotiation chamber, and the currency was her child's life. What would she do? How could a lone, pregnant woman, trapped between winter and a voracious summer, fight against forces so ancient and powerful? The answer, she realized with a shiver, lay somewhere in forgotten legends, in her grandmother's whispers, or perhaps in a strength she didn't yet know she possessed. The hum of the flower continued, a countdown to a pact she did not want to make but which seemed inevitable. The air in the cabin weighed like lead, dense with the terrible revelation. The visions still danced in Ilara's eyes, the sterile loneliness of a life without a pact, the image of herself, old and broken, extending empty hands to an indifferent sky. And in cruel contrast, the image of her baby, floating in an ethereal light, safe and serene, yet irremediably distant, a perfect offering for an eternal summer that was not hers. Ilara's heart beat wildly, a drum of dread and fury. It was not a choice, it was extortion. The dark purple flower, sprouting from the wooden floor beneath the symbol, pulsed with an almost painful intensity. Its faint glow at the center now seemed like an eye scrutinizing her, evaluating not only her life, but the life she carried. The grave hum, which had previously seemed a welcoming song, transformed into an insistent mantra, a countdown to an unthinkable sacrifice. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse but firm. "I won't. You will not have him." The flower seemed to vibrate in response, the hum intensifying, filling every crack in the cabin. It was not a threat, but a certainty, an ancient persistence that did not comprehend the word no. It was as if the cabin itself, now alive with the plants sprouting from the floor, was breathing the same silent demand. The green leaves extending from the wooden floor seemed to lean slightly towards the flower, as if revering it, or as if absorbing its energy, becoming silent accomplices. Ilara looked around, her desperate eyes searching for an exit, a sign, anything. The snow outside was an insurmountable wall, winter a death sentence. In here, summer was a golden prison, an altar for a sacrifice. But her grandmother's stories. Ilara clung to that memory like a shipwrecked survivor to a piece of wood. Her grandmother, the wise woman who knew the secrets of earth and sky, who spoke of the ancients not as gods to be worshipped, but as forces to be respected and at times negotiated with. "There was always a way," her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, an almost palpable memory. "The ancients seek balance, not annihilation. They give, but they also expect to receive. But what they receive, that can be shaped." Ilara closed her eyes, trying to concentrate, trying to search the depths of her memory. It wasn't about fighting them with brute force. It was about fighting with wisdom, with the cunning of the ancients. She remembered a story, told on cold winter nights, about a village that had been cursed with a relentless drought. The ancients demanded a life, the life of the chief's firstborn. But her grandmother had told how the chief, instead of surrendering his son, had offered something else. Something that represented life, but was not human life. What was it? Ilara frowned, her mind racing. A sacrifice of seeds, of fruits of the earth, of a piece of oneself, but not the entirety. A fair exchange, but one that preserved what was most precious. Her grandmother always emphasized the intention behind the offering. It wasn't just the object, but the heart that offered it. Ilara opened her eyes, a new determination shining in them. She was not helpless. She had the knowledge of her lineage, the wisdom of her grandmother. She approached the flower again, not with fear, but with renewed, almost scientific curiosity. The glow at the center of the flower seemed to intensify, as if sensing the change in her intention. She knelt, this time not in supplication, but in observation. The dark stem, the translucent petals, the hum, everything was a language, and she needed to learn it, to decipher it. What did the flower represent? The seed, life, the promise. But what kind of life? What kind of promise? If the ancients wanted a seed, a firstborn, perhaps they could be tricked, or rather satisfied with another seed, a seed that represented life, but was not her child. But what seed would be powerful enough to appease such an ancient force? Her eyes swept the wooden floor, now covered by a verdant tapestry of unknown plants, all growing under the eternal sun of the window. There were aromatic herbs, small bushes with bright berries, and vibrant-colored flowers, but none seemed to possess the same aura of power as the dark purple flower. Suddenly, her eyes fell upon something different. Hidden beneath the denser leaves of a creeping plant, a small shoot struggled to emerge. It was not like the other plants. Its stem was an almost black green, and its leaves, still small, had a subtle metallic sheen. It was different, more robust, more ancient. It was as if that small plant possessed an innate resilience, a primordial strength. Ilara extended her hand, her heart beating hard. It was a risk. She didn't know what it was, but she felt there was something special there. The hum of the dark purple flower seemed to diminish slightly, as if observing, waiting. Was it a test, a suggestion? With trembling fingers, Ilara touched the small shoot. A wave of cold, yet not unpleasant energy coursed through her arm. It wasn't the cold of snow, but the cold of deep earth, of rock, of primordial essence. Was this the seed she sought? A seed that could be offered in place of her own child? The struggle for survival had transformed once more. It was no longer about fleeing or hiding, but about negotiating, about finding the right currency for an ancestral pact. Ilara felt she was on the verge of a discovery, but also on the edge of a precipice. The cabin, once a refuge, was now a silent battlefield, and the most powerful weapon was knowledge. The hum of the dark purple flower increased again, a grave melody that seemed to echo the question in her mind. What will you offer? The hum of the dark purple flower echoed the question in her mind. A grave melody that seemed to vibrate in the very planks of the cabin. What will you offer? Ilara didn't have a ready answer, but she had an intuition, a whisper from the earth that seemed to guide her. Her fingers, still trembling, reached for the small shoot with the dark green stem and metallic leaves, hidden beneath the denser foliage. It wasn't a logical choice, but a profound resonance, a recognition of something ancient within something small. As she touched the shoot, the wave of cold, yet not unpleasant energy coursed through her arm again. It wasn't the paralyzing cold of snow, nor the oppressive heat of eternal summer. It was a cold that spoke of deep roots, of primordial rock, of a life that persisted against all odds. It was the essence of the earth itself, encapsulated in that small being. It was the seed she sought. Delicately, Ilara began to dig around the shoot with her fingernails, feeling the damp, soft wood beneath the layer of earth the plants had created. The dark purple flower, a few feet away, seemed to watch her, its central glow pulsing with an almost palpable curiosity. The hum diminished to a murmur, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath, awaiting Ilara's next move. She remembered her grandmother's stories, not just about what to offer, but how to offer. It wasn't a mere barter, but an act of respect, of recognition of the interconnectedness of all life. The offering was not just an object, it was a piece of her intention, of her soul, intertwined with the essence of what was given. With the shoot carefully loosened from the earth, Ilara held it in the palm of her hand. It was small, yet heavy, with a silent vitality that seemed to defy its size. She knelt again, this time before the symbol on the wooden floor, the same symbol that had attracted the dark purple flower. It was a circle with intricate lines, a map of energies, a convergence point for the power of the ancients. Ancients of the earth, she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion, yet firm in her determination. I heard your call. I understood your demand. You seek life, the seed, the firstborn for your eternal summer. She looked at the shoot in her hand, then at her belly, a silent connection between the two lives she held. But I cannot offer my child. He is mine, and he belongs to this world, to this winter and this warmth that I have created for him. The dark purple flower vibrated, the hum increasing again, but not with the same menacing insistence as before. It seemed more like a question, a deliberation. "I offer you a seed of equal power," Ilara continued, raising the shoot, "a seed that carries the strength of the deep earth, the resilience of rocks, the promise of life that persists even in darkness. It is not the life of my blood, but it is the life of the earth you govern. It is a seed that honors existence, that represents continuity, that will blossom and spread, enriching your domain." She placed the small shoot carefully in the center of the symbol, right next to the stem of the dark purple flower. Her fingers brushed the translucent petals of the flower, and she felt a pulsating energy, almost like a heartbeat. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, charged with an ancestral expectation. The sun from the window, previously constant and immutable, seemed to shimmer, its colors deepening for an instant, as if the eternal summer itself were watching. The hum of the dark purple flower reached a deafening crescendo, filling every corner of the cabin, vibrating in her bones. Ilara closed her eyes, her heart beating like a war drum in her chest. It was the moment of truth, acceptance or rejection, life or death. Then, as abruptly as it began, the hum ceased. A deep, heavy silence fell over the cabin, so complete that Ilara could hear the sound of her own blood rushing in her veins. She opened her eyes slowly, fearful of what she would find. The dark purple flower was different. Its central glow, which had previously seemed like a scrutinizing eye, now pulsed with a softer light, a deeper, more serene shade of purple. The dark stem, which had once seemed like an accusing finger, now curved slightly towards the small shoot Ilara had offered, almost as a gesture of recognition, and the small claw-shaped leaves seemed to have relaxed, losing their tension. But the most surprising change came from the shoot itself. As Ilara watched, a thin greenish mist began to emanate from it, rising and intertwining with the softer light of the dark purple flower. The mist did not dissipate. Instead, it seemed to be absorbed by the flower's petals, which glowed with renewed intensity, but now with a different, more welcoming warmth. A new vision, more subtle than the previous ones, floated into Ilara's mind. She did not see herself alone and barren, nor her baby floating distantly. Instead, she saw a lush forest filled with tall trees and vibrant plants, all with the same subtle metallic sheen as the shoot she had offered. And at the center of this forest, there was a single dark purple flower, immense and majestic, that seemed to nourish and protect all life around it. It was a vision of balance, of abundant and interconnected life, where the seed she had offered blossomed and thrived, not as a substitute but as an integral part of an ecosystem. The vision vanished, leaving Ilara with a sense of relief that made her collapse to the floor, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't a total acceptance, perhaps, but it was a truce, a successful negotiation. The ancients had accepted her alternative offering. They had found their balance. The earthy, damp scent in the cabin diminished, and the floral perfume became softer, less hallucinogenic, more like a garden fragrance after rain. The green plants covering the wooden floor seemed to vibrate with renewed energy, their leaves dancing softly in the invisible breeze. Ilara looked at the shoot, now firmly rooted beside the large purple flower. It seemed to have grown slightly, its small metallic leaves more open, absorbing the light of the eternal summer. She had succeeded. She had found a way, but the cabin was still surrounded by snow, and winter outside was still a threat. The truce with the ancients was a step, but not the end of the journey. She had saved her child from the eternal summer, but she still needed to save him from the relentless winter, and the strength she had found, her grandmother's wisdom, the connection to the earth, all of it would be needed for the next battle. The hum, now a soft, contented melody, seemed to whisper a new promise and a new challenge. The relief, though profound, was not an end, but a prelude. Ilara stood, her legs still trembling slightly, but with a new current of energy coursing through her veins. The cabin, once a desperate refuge, now seemed like a womb, a space of gestation for something new and incomprehensible. The soft hum of the dark purple flower, now an ancestral lullaby, and the vital energy of the metallic chute pulsed like a second heart in the house. They were her allies, whispering secrets of earth and sun, preparing her for the next and perhaps the grandest of transformations. Her eyes fell upon the chute again. It had grown visibly, its metallic leaves more open, more robust, absorbing the light of the eternal summer with a silent avidity. But it wasn't just the growth that fascinated her, it was the change it wrought. The wood around the chute, previously rough and cold, was now a darker shade, almost damp, and radiated a subtle warmth, different from the direct heat of the sun. It was a living warmth, which seemed to emanate from within the wood itself, as if the essence of the deep earth was infiltrating and transforming it. Ilara extended her hand and touched the transformed wood. It was no longer dead wood. It was something that breathed, that retained heat more efficiently, that nourished the other plants with unprecedented vitality. The greenish mist emanating from the chute was not just absorbed by the flower, a part of it seemed to spread subtly through the air, infusing the cabin with an almost tangible energy. The vision of the lush forest, with its metallic trees and the majestic purple flower at its center, was no longer just a distant image. It was a model, a guide. The seed she had offered was not merely a substitute. It was a catalyst. An idea, cold and audacious, began to form in her mind. If the chute could transform the wood, could it transform the walls of the cabin? Could it create a living barrier, pulsating with the warmth of eternal summer against the icy embrace of winter? With almost reverent care, Ilara knelt again. She observed the chute, feeling the energy it radiated. The greenish mist seemed denser now, almost an ethereal veil. She needed a part of this life, a fragment that she could take to other places. With the stone knife she always carried, her grandmother's inheritance, she carefully cut a small piece of the transformed wood that surrounded the chute, a piece that seemed infused with the same metallic vitality. The piece of wood was not heavy. It was light, almost hollow, but it pulsed with a cold, vibrant energy. Ilara held it in the palm of her hand, feeling the promise it carried. It was like holding a seed of light, a fragment of the eternal summer. She moved to one of the deepest cracks in the wall, where the icy air entered unimpeded. The contrast between the cabin's warmth and the glacial breath was shocking, a brutal reminder of the reality outside. With trembling fingers, she pressed the piece of transformed wood against the crack. Nothing happened immediately. The cold continued to seep in, but Ilara did not give up. She closed her eyes, concentrating, visualizing the lush forest, the interconnectedness of the metallic trees, the living barrier they formed. She felt the pulse of the dark purple flower in her chest, the energy of the metallic chute in her hands. She poured her intention, her hope, her need to protect her child into that small fragment of wood. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began. The transformed wood in the crack did not expand, but began to glow with a subtle greenish luminescence, the same hue as the mist emanating from the main chute, and the cold. The cold seemed to recede, not completely, but the intensity of the icy breath diminished, as if meeting a resistance. It was slow, painfully slow, but it was working. The piece of wood was absorbing the cold, transforming it, or perhaps creating a micro-barrier of vital warmth. But a single fragment would not be enough. She needed more, much more. The vision of the forest returned, clearer now. The metallic trees were not just strong, they were interconnected, their roots and branches forming an impenetrable network. She didn't just need pieces, she needed a network of life. Ilara looked at the main chute, then at the window of eternal summer. The sun didn't just warm, it catalyzed. She needed more catalysts, more seeds of this new spring. The cabin would not just be an oasis, it would be a winter garden, a living fortress against desolation. The task was monumental, her pregnancy advanced, the winter relentless. But now, Ilara did not feel the despair of before. She felt the urgency, yes, but also an iron determination. The seed of the new spring she had found was not just a hope. It was a responsibility, and she was ready to cultivate it, so her child could know not just life, but abundant life, even in the heart of the harshest winter. The soft pulse of the dark purple flower and the vital energy of the metallic shoot seemed to be her new allies, whispering secrets of earth and sun, preparing her for the next and perhaps the grandest of transformations. Winter waited, but Ilara now had the seed of a new kind of spring. The seed of the new spring pulsed in Ilara's hands, a fragment of wood that was more than wood. It was promise. It was life. But a single fragment, however potent, was just a whisper against the roar of winter. She needed a symphony. The vision of the metallic forest, of the intertwining living network, was her map. The main shoot, absorbing the light of the eternal summer, was its heart. Ilara needed to replicate that energy, spread it, weave a new skin for the cabin. With the stone knife, she began to work. Not cutting the shoot itself, it was too precious, the source, but carefully scraping the wood around it, the wood that had already been transformed. Each sliver, however small, radiated that subtle warmth, that greenish mist that was the signature of deep life. It was slow, meticulous work, and with each scrape, the original wood of the cabin seemed to yield a little more of its essence, becoming darker, denser, more alive. She mixed these slivers with a little melted snow water, creating a thick, glowing paste. It was no ordinary mortar. It was a paste of life. With her hands, Ilara began to apply it to the cracks, the crevices, every point where the cold dared to infiltrate. It was like sealing open wounds, but with a balm that not only healed, but transformed. With each application, the paste reacted. First, a more intense greenish glow, then a silent absorption into the cabin's wood. It didn't become invisible. On the contrary, the wood around the paste began to darken, to pulse with its own warmth, as if the life of the shoot was spreading, taking root in the very walls. The scent of damp earth and polished metal filled the cabin, a strange yet comforting perfume. Days became a succession of arduous work and fascinated observation. Ilara felt the fatigue of advanced pregnancy weigh on her limbs. Her back ached, her feet swelled, but the urgency in her heart and the promise in her womb propelled her. Each time she felt the baby's gentle movement, a new wave of determination swept over her. It wasn't just for her, it was for him, for a future that would not be dominated by the cold. The cabin began to change. The walls, previously a monotonous cracked brown, were now a mosaic of darker tones, almost black in places, interspersed with greenish veins that seemed to glow with an inner light. The warmth no longer came solely from the eternal summer window. It emanated from the walls themselves, a soft, constant heat that seemed to embrace the home. Cold drafts, once persistent intruders, were now mere whispers, quickly muffled by the living barrier Ilara was building. The other plants, the vegetables growing on the wooden floor, also reacted to the transformation. They grew more vigorous, their leaves greener, their fruits more abundant. The greenish mist emanating from the transformed walls seemed to nourish everything, creating a microclimate of spring within the small refuge. The dark purple flower at the center of it all seemed to vibrate with even greater intensity. its fragrance now sweeter, more intoxicating, almost like sacred incense. But the transformation was not uniform. Ilara noticed that the areas closest to the eternal summer window and the main chute reacted more quickly, with greater force. The sunlight filtered through that magical portal was the catalyst, the energy that accelerated the process. She began to think about how she could direct this light, how she could use the cabin itself as a conduit for the summer's energy. The idea was bold, almost insane. If the walls could be transformed, why not the floor? And if the floor could be transformed, why not the ceiling? The cabin would not just be a shelter, it would be a living organism, breathing eternal summer, exhaling warmth and life. She began to spread the transformed wood paste in deliberate patterns, creating connecting lines and circles, mimicking the roots and branches of the metallic forest she saw in her mind. It was intuitive work, guided by her grandmother's ancestral wisdom, which spoke of the harmony of natural patterns, of how life organizes itself to thrive. The tension, however, did not diminish. Winter outside offered no respite. One night, a particularly violent snowstorm hit the cabin. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, whipping the walls with icy gusts. Snow piled up against the door, threatening to bury the small refuge. Ilara felt the floor tremble beneath her feet, the sound of the wind penetrating even through the transformed walls. She hugged her belly, feeling the baby stir, as if he too sensed the fury outside. Fear tried to settle in, but was quickly replaced by a wave of fury and determination. She had worked too hard, fought too much, for Winter to win now. Ilara stood up, walking to the wall most exposed to the wind. The transformed wood there glowed with greater intensity, pulsating with a visible warmth. She touched the surface and felt the vibration. The cabin was resisting. It wasn't just a passive barrier, it was an active defense, pushing the cold back, absorbing its energy, transforming it. The storm lasted all night, but at dawn, a heavy silence fell over the landscape. Ilara opened the door with difficulty, pushing aside the accumulated snow. The world outside was a white, untouched wilderness. But the cabin stood firm, a beacon of life amidst the desolation. The walls now were not just darker, they had an almost metallic texture, a subtle sheen that reflected the pale winter light. The cabin had become a pulsating heart, a womb of life amidst the ice. But Ilara knew the battle was not won. Winter was vast, and the cabin, however transformed, was still a tiny point. She had created a sanctuary, yes, but what would happen when her child was born? How could she extend this spring beyond the walls, into the world outside? The answer, she felt, lay in the main chute, in the dark purple flower, and in the window of eternal summer. They were the key not just to survive, but to flourish. The next step would not just be about protection, but about expansion. The seed of spring had germinated in the walls, but its destiny was to spread, to transform winter itself. And Ilara, the old pregnant widow, would be the gardener of this new era. Winter waited, but Ilara now held the seed of a new kind of spring. The silence that followed the storm was heavier than the snow itself, an icy mantle that suffocated the world. But inside the cabin, there was a new kind of silence, that of pulsating life, a heart beating against winter's chest. The walls, now a dark and iridescent mosaic, exuded a soft warmth, a promise fulfilled. Ilara ran her hand over the transformed surface, feeling the vibration, the life she had infused into the wood. The cabin was no longer a mere shelter, it was a living organism, breathing eternal summer, a womb of life amidst the ice. But the sanctuary she had created, however miraculous, was just a minuscule point. Outside, winter waited, vast and relentless. And the child she carried needed more than a refuge. He needed a world, a spring to call his own. The seed of the new spring had germinated in the walls, but its destiny was to spread, to transform winter itself. Her eyes fell upon the dark purple flower, which now vibrated with an almost feverish intensity. Its fragrance, once sweet and intoxicating, had become more complex, with a metallic and earthy hint, like the scent of a forest after rain. Ilara felt an irresistible pull. The flower was not just beautiful, it was the key she knew. The flower and the main shoot, bathed in the light of the eternal summer window, were the epicenter of all that energy. She approached, her heavy belly brushing the transformed floor. The summer light, filtered through the window, fell directly onto the flower, making its petals seem to glow with an inner light. Ilara noticed something new. At the center of the flower, where before there had only been a dark stamen, now there were minuscule formations, almost like metallic spores, gleaming with the same greenish luminescence as the mist from the shoot. They were seeds. Not ordinary seeds, but seeds of metal and life, encapsulating the essence of the new spring. With almost reverent care, Ilara extended her hand. Her fingers brushed the formations, and one of them detached, falling softly into her palm. It was small, smaller than a grain of rice, but it radiated a subtle warmth, a contained energy. It was the answer. The dark purple flower was not just a catalyst, it was a generator, a womb for the seeds that could spread life. The idea that formed in her mind was bold, almost insane. If she could plant these seeds, not just inside the cabin but outside it, perhaps she could create a path, a trail of life that would extend beyond the walls. But how? The soil outside was frozen hard as rock. The seeds would need protection, a conducive environment to germinate. She looked at the transformed wood paste she still had in a pot. It was the balm, the healer, the transformer. What if she used the paste to prepare the soil, to create a bed of life for the seeds? The decision was made with the same iron determination that had driven her to fortify the cabin. She put on her warmest clothes, took the stone knife and the pot of paste, and opened the door. The cold hit her like a punch, a brutal reminder of the reality outside. The accumulated snow reached her waist, and the biting wind seemed to want to tear her skin. But Ilara did not retreat. She began to dig, not in the snow, but in the frozen earth right in front of the door, where the snow wasn't as deep. It was arduous, painful work. The stone knife barely scratched the hard surface. Her muscles screamed in protest, and the icy air burned her lungs. With each strike, the image of her child, of the world she wanted to build for him, propelled her. She needed a small, exposed patch of earth where she could apply the paste. After what seemed an eternity, she managed to scrape a small area, a circle of bare earth, about a handspan in diameter. Her fingers were numb, but she didn't stop. With trembling hands, she spread the transformed wood paste over the exposed earth. The paste, which inside the cabin glowed with a vibrant green, seemed to struggle against the intense cold, its radiance dimming but not disappearing completely. She felt the subtle warmth emanating from it, a small bubble of resistance against the icy vastness. Then, with her heart pounding in her chest, Ilara took one of the minuscule metallic seeds from the dark purple flower and carefully placed it in the center of the paste. She covered it with a little more paste, as if nesting it in a cradle of life. She knew it was a gamble against the odds, against the relentless nature of winter. The next few days were excruciatingly tense. Ilara opened the door several times a day, braving the cold, to check on her little experiment. The paste seemed to have hardened, forming a greenish crust over the earth. But there was no sign of life. Fear tried to settle in, whispering about the futility of her efforts, about the impossibility of defying winter. But each time she felt the gentle, yet now stronger movement of the baby in her womb, a new wave of hope surged through her. He was there, a new life, pulsing, waiting for a world she was determined to create. Then, On the morning of the third day, as the pale winter sun barely rose above the horizon, Ilara opened the door. And there it was. At the center of the greenish crust, a tiny shoot, a green so vibrant it seemed almost fluorescent, had emerged. It was fragile, delicate, but undeniably alive. A small metallic leaf, with the same texture as the cabin's transformed walls, timidly unfolded towards the grey sky. And around the shoot, the snow seemed to have receded a little, melted by an invisible warmth emanating from that small point of life. It was a miracle, a small yet powerful miracle. The seed had germinated. Spring had dared to manifest itself even in the heart of winter. Ilara felt warm tears stream down her face, not from sadness, but from a deep and overwhelming joy. She had succeeded. She had planted the first seed of the new spring outside the cabin walls. But the task was still monumental. A single shoot was just the beginning. She needed more seeds, more paste, more time. Winter would offer no respite, and her increasingly heavy body reminded her of the urgency. Each day, the baby stirred with greater strength, as if ready to join the battle. Ilara looked at the shoot, then at the vast, relentless white. The vision of the metallic forest, of the intertwining living network, returned to her mind, clearer, more real. She didn't just need shoots, she needed a network of life, a web that could extend, connect, and ultimately transform winter itself. The cabin was the heart, the main shoot and the dark purple flower were the lungs, and the seeds were the arteries, ready to carry life to every corner of that icy world. The next step would not just be about protection, but about expansion, about weaving a new tapestry of life. And Ilara, the old pregnant widow, would be the gardener of this new era, planting hope, one seed at a time. The howl of winter was no longer a distant protest. It was a fury descending upon the cabin. The horizon, previously merely threatening, was now a wall of swirling white and leaden grey, advancing with the speed of a hungry predator. Ilara watched through the window, her heart beating wildly. The storm was not just forming, it was swallowing the world. And at the center of its fury were the minuscule points of life she had planted, the fragile arteries of her new spring. The wind began to whip the cabin with a violence that made it groan, like a ship at sea. Snowflakes the size of coins beat against the wood, and the sound was deafening. Ilara knew she couldn't go out. Her body, heavy and aching, was already at its limit. The baby, as if sensing the urgency of the moment, stirred with renewed strength, a constant reminder that time was running out. She needed the network to work, and she needed it to work now. She dragged herself to the door, not to open it, but to peek through the cracks, to feel the pulse of the world outside. The first shoot, the one closest to the cabin, was being battered, but its metallic leaves seemed to vibrate, resisting. The thin, greenish line extending beneath the snow seemed to glow faintly, an almost imperceptible pulse of life against the storm's darkness. But would it be enough? The storm reached its peak. The outside world became a white, violent blur. The cabin shook, and Ilara could hear the wood creaking under the pressure of wind and snow. She huddled near the fire, trying to warm herself, but the cold seemed to penetrate the walls, biting into her bones. Fear, which she had kept at bay for so long, now tried to envelop her, whispering about the futility of her efforts, about the inevitability of winter. Then, something began to change. Despite the deafening howl, Ilara perceived a different sound, a subtle hum that seemed to come from beneath the cabin floor. The wood, which had become living soil, seemed to vibrate with increasing energy. The dark purple flower in the corner didn't just glow, it pulsed, its petals opening and closing in a slow, powerful rhythm, releasing a cloud of golden pollen that danced in the air. And most importantly, the minuscule metallic formations at its center, the seeds, were being expelled in a profusion never before seen, falling to the floor like stardust. The hum intensified, and Ilara felt a warmth, not just from the fire, but coming from below, from the floor itself. She looked at the summer window. The light streaming in was no longer just comforting. It was intense, almost blinding, flooding the cabin with vibrant energy. The air grew dense with the scent of wet earth and flowers, an aroma of spring that defied the fury outside. And then she felt it. A sharp pang, a contraction that made her gasp. The baby. It was time. Pain overwhelmed her, but amidst the agony, a clarity settled in. Winter was fighting back, but so was life. It was a battle, and she was at its center. Each contraction seemed to echo the earth's struggle outside to be reborn. She clung to the wall, breathing deeply, trying to concentrate. Outside, the storm roared, but the hum of life was stronger. Ilara crawled to the door and, with superhuman effort, opened a crack. What she saw made her forget the pain for an instant. The shoots, they weren't just resisting, they were growing. The thin greenish lines beneath the snow had thickened, becoming pulsating veins of vibrant green. And around each shoot, the snow was melting at an accelerated rate, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. But that wasn't all. The shoots were lengthening, branching out, and the metallic leaves were expanding, intertwining. The vision of the metallic forest, which had once been a fantasy, was materializing before her eyes. The plants grew with terrifying speed, forming a dense, gleaming network that seemed to push the snow back. The sound of the howling wind began to diminish, muffled by the rustling of new leaves, by the snapping of extending stems. With each of Ilara's contractions, the network of life outside seemed to leap forward. The seeds the flower released inside the cabin seemed to find their way to the exterior through the cracks and transformed wood, fueling the growth. The wood paste she had spread now seemed to be a catalyst, a bridge between the cabin's inner life and the icy vastness. The pain was excruciating, but Ilara refused to yield. She leaned against the door, watching the miracle unfold. The network of life wasn't just growing, it was connecting, forming a living barrier, a shield against the storm. The metallic stems rose like pillars, and the leaves formed a gleaming canopy which seemed to absorb winter's fury and transform it into energy. And then, the most incredible thing happened. Above the network of life, a piece of the sky began to open. It wasn't the pale, distant sun from before, but a deep, vibrant blue, like a summer day's sky. The storm continued to rage around, but within that circle of life, winter was being pushed back. With a cry that mingled with the sound of the wind and the rustling of the plants, Ilara gave birth. The world seemed to stop for an instant. The pain vanished, replaced by an overwhelming warmth. In her arms, a small body, warm and wet, cried, her son. She held him close, tears streaming down her face, not from pain, but from immeasurable joy and relief. The baby's cry was the sweetest sound she had ever heard, a melody of life that joined the hum of the new forest. When exhaustion finally allowed her to lift her head, Ilara looked outside. The storm had retreated. Where before there had been a white, relentless wilderness, now stretched a forest of life. Metallic stems rose towards the blue sky, their leaves gleaming with the light of a sun that seemed warmer, more real. The snow had melted in a vast circle around the cabin, revealing dark, rich earth, dotted with shoots and flowers she had never seen before. The cabin was no longer an isolated refuge. It was the heart of a new world. The dark purple flower within it continued to pulse, but now seemed more serene, more majestic. The seeds were no longer just a promise, they were reality. Ilara pressed her son against her chest, the warmth of his small body radiating life. She had planted the first seed, and it had responded, She had created a network, and it had expanded. She had defied winter, and spring had found its way. The world outside was still vast, and winter still existed beyond the border of the new forest. But Ilara had created a sanctuary, a cradle of life for her son. She was the gardener of this new era, and her son was the first flower of a spring that promised to extend, seed by seed, until the ice was just a distant memory. The howl of winter had been silenced, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the cry of a newborn, the melody of a new beginning.